right, so just a little bit about both of them. You probably know them from the Schoolhouse 302. They have a brilliant podcast that they've constructed also, and they're both co-founders of that. But also, we've got a former deputy superintendent, which is TJ, and then Dr. Joseph Jones is a superintendent. You both are in Delaware, correct?
Correct.
The first state, Josh, the first state.
I need to highlight that, of course. So, gentlemen, you both are authors of 6 books. You're both brilliant individuals. I've been connected to both of you for so long, and we are just so honored that you're here with us. Before we start, though, is there anything else that you want to highlight about your wonderful background in education?
No, let's get to it.
Let's just get into it. All right, you guys are ready for business. I love it. All right, so first off, you guys position feedback as a support for teachers. I know that's kind of like your passion topic. You've written a lot about that. So not everyone views feedback that way. So will you just tell us how you reframe feedback as supportive?
You want to kick us off, TJ?
Sure thing. So I think it's actually connected a little bit to what we were just hearing from Joe Sanfilippo about in terms of highlighting strengths. People often see feedback, or even when I need to give feedback, as I need to highlight something that somebody did wrong or fix something, or they think that because I'm going to get feedback, it's going to be pointing out my deficiencies. We actually position that a little bit differently in that we remind school leaders that one tenet of feedback is actually praise. And so we want to do praise better. We want to highlight the strengths. There's a lot of behavioral psychology and neuroscience behind that, actually, in terms of reinforcing what people do well, having them repeat the behaviors that make the most sense and are effective for young people. And one way we do that is with praise. We do have 2 other tenets that we use when we train school leaders. One is performance coaching, and the other is professional dialogue. And so the thing that we highlight is that 2/3 of feedback is about conversations and getting on the same page with people and highlighting what they do well. And so that's why we feel it's supportive, and we can talk about the performance coaching part of it as well. Joe?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of some of what TJ said, we often think of feedback in silos. And I think honestly, Josh, that's where the issue is. The feedback, when you're thinking eval, walkthroughs, that's when you already made your first mistake. If you're a leader, you should constantly embrace the idea that you're always giving feedback. And 2 major buckets is growth and development. So think about your new teachers who you're always giving feedback to, your new administrators, you're always giving feedback to. So you're wearing a cloak of communication all the time. The other thing I think that has dawned on TJ and I, though, as we grew into our roles, is the whole notion of organizational coherence. If you're a leader, you're always thinking alignment, you're always thinking of coherence. And I think that is what is driven through feedback. So when you're talking about coaching individuals, we're not talking about judgment. Now, is there a place for judgment and accountability? Absolutely. That's why we have standards, and are we meeting those standards? But on the flip side, we're always moving towards our goals. And if you're thinking like, oh, I'm not sure I should tell this to the person because, I would say you're immediately that's self-doubt. That's not an issue with communication or feedback. That's a self issue that you have to wrestle with and get over.
And Josh, one more thing, just to
Yeah.
double down on the need for praise in schools. 70% of people say that they don't get praised at work and celebrated at work, but yet 80% of managers say that they use it regularly. And so the problem is not that we're not trying. The problem is that's not landing right. And so we use models to help school leaders understand how to do this work better, because we think we're praising and celebrating our teachers, and they're not feeling praised and celebrated. So there's a disconnect, and we've got to improve our communication efforts. You can't praise people too much. That's another thing that comes up. It's like, well, is it too much fluff? Is it too much praise? There's no such thing as that.
Yeah, which is probably a perfect segue to something that you all talk about. Well, I've heard you speak on it and you write about it, which is that culture of nice. So will you describe what that is and how it can be implemented within your school district?
Joe, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, we say that, by nature, those who, coming to this field, we're altruistic. We want to help. Yes, you may love your content, but you typically love people more. You love kids. You want to see them learn and grow. And so for a lot of people, it can seem very contradictory to start offering feedback, and especially if it's constructive criticism and you're having courageous conversations, that you're now inherently contradicting why you went into this field. And we say when you think that way, when you do not see growth and feedback under the guise of feedback, or growth and improvement under the guise of feedback, you're falling into this trap of the circle of nice. And so break away from that. We don't want people who are nice. We want people who are kind, who live in a space of dignity and respect. But nice, that assumes now a much different relationship. Nice is where I'm supporting you regardless of your effectiveness. I'm nice to you, and that's not what we're talking about here. We need our students to achieve. That's the bottom line. We need our teachers to excel. The only way to really get out of that space of nice is then, have a backdrop of standards and help people meet those standards, especially if you have your goals set out for the school year. How close are you to achieving them? And that's where feedback comes in. But we see this time and time again. People simply don't want to hurt other people's feelings. And we say you got to realize that most people want to do better. They want to excel. And you know who's not worried about their own feelings? Your best teachers. They're not worried about that. So just think of your best and you run with your best. TJ?
Yeah, I would just also say that we typically go over these 9 candor cancellations that we really like. They're archetypes of leaders who fall into this trap of building a culture of nice. And you can think of like the holder backer is one of the cancellations, and this is a school leader who thinks something that they don't say. Now, the candor cancellations are supposed to be funny, but they're not to poke fun. We typically all see ourselves in one or more of these cancellations. The ambiguous is somebody who talks and talks and talks,
God.
the whole meeting talking, and we don't know what they were trying to say. And so that's the archetype. And we've been there, right? We've all been there where that's happened, and we fall prey to that ourselves because we're trying to not hurt people's feelings, like Joe said. But we just also want to remind school leaders that we're always in improvement mode because there isn't a such thing as a status quo. We talk to folks sometimes that say, well, we're in this area, we're trying to maintain the status quo. That's impossible. It will incrementally get worse if that's what you're trying to do. It might be imperceptible that how bad it's getting, but you cannot maintain the status quo. You always have to be in improvement mode.
Yeah, let's talk about that improvement mode even more so in regards to student behavior. So, as far as the feedback provided to teachers, how do we provide that feedback while also trying to manage student behavior better in the classroom?
You want to go, TJ?
Sure. I think, the first thing we have to observe in the classroom is the classroom culture, the feeling that you get when you go into the room. Is it safe? Are students learning? You know that when you walk into a classroom and you even just take in what it feels like to be in that room. Josh, you and I have talked about this before with Mitch and Kim and some others. And so we want to take a pause. We train leaders when they get into a classroom, the first thing that they want to do is to pause and reflect on how it feels to be in that room. And then we can help teachers improve the classroom culture, the classroom feeling, the feeling of safety. But in particular, I would say just like any other feedback, walkthrough feedback, evaluation feedback, when we talk to teachers about instructional strategies, and we're writing a book right now about instructional leadership, so it's top of mind, and we want leaders to be in instructional powerhouses pedagogically, but we don't always focus on student behavior and the moves that are necessary to maintain behavior in the classroom. And so when we point out some of the things that teachers are doing well, back to praise, I would also want to point out some of the things that they do well to maintain that classroom culture, to reinforce the behaviors that are working to keep the kids safe and well informed as they learn. And so just an example would be, we're in a classroom and we want teachers to use collaborative structures as an instructional strategy. That's great, but there are also other behavioral management strategies that we can give feedback on, like using proximity versus calling a kid out from across the room. That never works. So yeah, we want to give teachers feedback on that part of the classroom environment as well.
Yeah, the only piece I would add to that is there's an excellent quote by James Clear. People don't need more motivation, they need clarity. And the mistake administrators make is they do not create clear expectations, whether it's for what classroom management should look like or what instruction should look like. And this is where feedback gets tough because if you haven't provided that for your teachers, then shame on you. When you hire somebody and you're onboarding someone, you can say, hey, look, this is exactly what we like our classrooms to look like. This is why in this type of environment, students thrive. You will experience less frustration, less anxiety, less burnout. Okay, and here's how we can help you get there. And so that then goes from the leader to the teacher, any mentors that are in that teacher's life. And then if you even have a veteran teacher, you spend time with them really developing that culture. What we'll do is talk about it once, assume because we cognitively understand it, we know how to do it. And that's a mistake. Just because we get something doesn't mean we know how to do it. But we often make that leap. And this dawned on me when I read Carol Dweck's Mindset. I don't know how many people even read the book, but everybody was quoting her. I was like, well, I ain't seeing it. I don't see it anywhere, but people could quote her. And so it's like, I think there's a gap between what we really think we know and how we can actually do that in a classroom. And then same with instruction. When TJ's talking about things like specific praise, we're not just praising, things that aren't of interest to us. You may comment on the bulletin board if it's excellent, it's thematic, it drives literacy, things of that nature, and a teacher put a ton of time into it. That's perfectly fine. But we're anchoring our feedback to our expectations. That's the game changer. It also removes the subjectivity. So if you have a focus on literacy, and like TJ just mentioned, student discourse, if student discourse is the strategy that emphasizes student literacy, and you're doing save the last word for me, right? It's a cool strategy, but that is a very well developed student discourse strategy. Students have to be taught. You would anchor your feedback to the teacher all around literacy, all around the professional development that went around that strategy, how well it was conducted, and then what resources and supports do they need. We're in a teacher shortage. I'm not looking to get rid of teachers. I'm looking to make our teachers better. So all the feedback I provide is to make them better. And that's in a relationship I establish in the interview. That's a question I would ask up front. How well do you take constructive feedback? Because I need you to understand if you're going to work in Newcastle County VOTEC, you are going to get an enormous amount of feedback. And if they sign on, we treat them like the professionals they are. My beloved Eagles are 2-0. Could you imagine a quarterback not getting scripted feedback continuously off the field and on the field? Just because somebody makes $15 million a year doesn't make them more important than a teacher in a classroom. And so they deserve that. That's our frames that limit our ability to give them that feedback.
TJ, you look like you were about to say something, so I don't want to cut you off.
You
We
saw
always have something to say.
I know TJ specifically always has something to say. You can add to that, buddy, or you want to move on?
Yeah, no, I would say that back to the circle of nice to what Joe's saying, and just always being in improvement mode is really important for school leaders. I mentioned that you can't really maintain the status quo. But a lot of times right now with teacher retention, and again, back to the point that Joe was making, we want our teachers to be happy,
Mhm.
and we go about the business of trying to make people happy at work, which actually doesn't work to make them happy. What works to make people happy is that they're good at the job, that they're good at the work. So when we improve people's skills and we deepen their capacity, then they're happier to do the things that matter most, and in the most important spaces in our schools, which is the classroom. So whether it's a new teacher or a veteran teacher, we always want to look to improve because we know from the science that that's also what's going to trigger happiness and the feeling that I'm having an impact and that I'm doing a good job and that I'm needed and all the things that people like to feel, especially teachers, especially school leaders. We want to be effective. And so I think dropping this notion that making people happy at work will make them happier is not gonna work. And so I hope that makes sense. But we do all of these things, good things, right? Good things like um, I believe deeply in having food at the faculty meeting, but that's not necessarily going to work to make people happy in the long run.
Josie just put a comment here. Teachers need to hear that they're appreciated. I think everyone's feeling that, even as the school year has just begun. You had talked about constructive feedback, and a lot of times, I mean, it really doesn't matter your title. I mean, feedback is just something that you need to have as a skill, but also with that skill is sometimes the candid nature of it. So if someone's like, you know what, I really want to be better about candid feedback, what might they do to kind of start that process?
Go
You want
ahead.
me to go, TJ?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd also go back to clarity, Josh. I think people often struggle on giving candid feedback because they're not sure what to say. If we're really being honest with each other, sometimes we're at a loss. We know something wasn't completely right. We want to provide some feedback. So we have to make sure we're completely upskilled. And this is something we're writing about right now, that just because you create a strategic plan as a leader, you may not know how to fully actuate that. Just because you adopt literacy as a strategy in your school or as a focus in your school, you don't know all of what it means to have the tenets of literacy play out in all the classrooms. So make sure you upskill. The second is we know this. Some people are also just fearful. And we can't escape that. Listen, it's very natural. Our palms get sweaty, our heart starts to race. If you're not having that reaction, you might not be human. I would check that. But embrace it. I had a mentor one time said, Joe, just, those butterflies you feel in your stomach, get them flying in formation, and then that's once you have it, and you can start then to motivate people through this idea of giving them very clear constructive feedback. The other thing I would say is prepare. What do you want to say? How do you want to say it? I've used this line several times. I've used it as a superintendent. Thank you. Like if Charlie and I were meeting, I would just say, hey, thank you for meeting with me today. I have a few things I definitely want to cover, and some of the stuff I'm going to say is going to be a little tough to hear. Believe it or not, it's a little tough to say. So I'm going to look down at my notes. Forgive me for that, but I want to make sure this conversation's as productive as possible. And I think so, we have to upskill, perfectly fine. Learn how to control your emotions, and start to get your center, and then plan. Know what you're going to say and get ready for rebuttals, plan all of that. And I think that actually makes it a lot easier to have hard conversations. And then if you need to memorize stems, look, I want to have a tough conversation with you. Thank you for joining me today. You say something tough. Look, I know what I just said is difficult. How did that land? I want to make sure you're hearing what I'm saying. And you can even say, listen to something like, look, we've worked with each other a very long time. I need for this relationship to stay intact. You're an excellent worker, but this was not excellent. And we need to discuss it. I would not be doing my job if I didn't have this conversation. And I think you can memorize all of those. We think we should have all of this in our head at our beck and call all the time. We got to prepare.
Well, that
Yeah,
could
three.
be. also not only leaders to teachers, but teachers to students too, right? I mean, it's the same concept.
It's 100%
100%.
the same concept. And also athletics. It exists everywhere and in schools. And 3% of people have been trained on communication methods. When we do our training, we ask people if they've been trained in communication. Typically, when they say yes, they've been trained in a tool like the evaluation tool, but they haven't actually been trained in how to communicate well and to memorize the stems that Joe just went over and specific praise and performance coaching and professional dialogue, all of the things that we use as tools when we talk to school leaders.
So glad
So
I'm
again,
catching the ball.
3% have been trained, and we want to increase that for schools. And here's another tip. If you, I don't think anybody on this call should wake up tomorrow and start being extra candid with people in your school. You know, candid and compassion is what we say. Like that's not fair. But announcing that you're going to be candid is to say, look, we've got some work to do, and I've been holding some things back, and I can't do that anymore and look myself in the mirror as the school leader here. So I'm going to improve my candor. I'm going to get better at being candid. I'm going to get better at communicating the expectations. And by the way, getting better is one of Covey's 13 high trust behaviors. So go grab your 13 high trust behaviors, and you'll see that holding people accountable and getting better actually builds trust, not the other way around.
And you're just throwing me segues left and right. That's awesome. All right. I want to talk about that accountability piece. So for our leaders that are on with us or are going to view later, what happens when educators that you're providing feedback, it could be constructive, candid, whatever, are resisting the change that you're offering?
Joe, you want me to go first?
Sure.
I will say resistance is typically not, I wouldn't go straight to insubordination with resistance. If somebody's not doing what you're asking them to do, I would assume they just don't know how. And so that's the first piece. The second piece is an ideas model. Joe can help me with this. We built an ideas model for school leaders to follow when they meet resistance. And it's identify the core of the problem, describe a clear alternative, explain what looks like in action, and then here's the two critical pieces at the end. Ask for a good time to follow up and schedule a date to return. We should be letting people put their best foot forward, meaning I haven't seen this out of you yet. Maybe it's a behavioral change that you want them to use to manage the behaviors in the classroom, but I want you to tell me when you're going to do it so I can be here to check it out and to provide feedback on it. And that also opens up the door for somebody to say, I'm not comfortable, I'm not confident with it. And that means more professional learning, not just, you know, believing that people aren't going to do what they're expected to do. I believe 98, 99% of people and the kids too wake up and go to school and they want to do a good job.
And Josh, I would add this is where candor really comes into play. So I'll make two quick points. One, if you're going to have plans and initiatives, you have to realize that those things don't inspire people. People inspire plans and initiatives. So you have to get them on board. TJ and I fight against the term buy-in because buy-in assumes that you did not collaborate, right? I'm selling you something. That's when we buy. I don't want to build a culture where I'm not investing in my people and they don't have a voice. Now, that's not always the case where you have the opportunity to bring them in. But if you're constantly in a position where you're selling, your ideas and thoughts, then you have no distributive leadership and no collaboration in your organization. That has to be rethought immediately. The second piece is, and this is where the candor really comes in, if everyone on this call was able to tell us who's the one person who's going to resist, I guarantee they could tell us. They know already. So go talk to that person. This is not rocket science. If you know you're going to have a curmudgeon on your staff, go talk to the curmudgeon and just say, look, we have to roll this out. I'm letting you know ahead of time. And if they say why, say because last faculty meeting when we brought something up, you stood up and challenged everybody. It became completely unproductive. But people don't want to say that. They would much rather just say like, all right, we're going to roll this out and pray to God TJ's sick on Tuesday. And it's like that's not beneficial. But if you ask the person, and this is where passion and why people came into this profession, when TJ said give them the benefit of the doubt, people who are typically at 25, 30 years, they've just lost their passion, they've lost their inspiration. And I guarantee you, most of them can tell you when that 17th initiative when they weren't heard and they knew it wasn't going to work because they had a whole insight into the problem and they were never asked. And so just have relationships with your folks, talk to them, keep it simple. These conversations get difficult when you think of each communication as the peak of a mountain. And if here's your first peak and you talk to your people, and then here's your second peak 2 weeks later, that valley has been filled with enormous amount of communication and information, typically might not even be right, but that's what you're battling. But if you keep your peaks or your mountains very close together, then you're creating that clarity. You're building those high trust behaviors. The people are going to trust you. You're being transparent and you're asking their opinion. Say, look, we want to do this. I still remember vividly. I was a young AP. I was about 28 years old. We got a new administrator, a new principal, and the individual wanted to switch up our departments into like a steering committee. It wasn't a bad idea, but it had no relevance. People weren't necessarily thinking this was a good idea, and he just brought it up in a meeting. And I pulled him aside. I said, look, this is a staff. I was over the 25th assistant principal in 6 years. You're the fifth principal in that same amount of time. They don't care what you have to say. They're the soldiers. We're visiting their playground. And you have to respect that. And then it started to dawn on this principle like, maybe I got to start asking my folks what's going on. But don't be afraid to have that initial conversation. Then, if you know they're being resistant, they're now being insubordinate, they're not following a plan, that's when I would say use progressive discipline. But I would wait to get to that point. But there might be a time where you do get to that point.
Looking at the time, we got to close this down, but I put your website in the chat. So everyone needs to head over to the schoolhouse302.com. Obviously, Joe and TJ are brilliant. They have a ton of resources for you. So make sure you head over to that website. If you need help specifically on this topic, these two are, like I said, absolutely brilliant and can help you in any way possible. So make sure you're reaching out to them and they will make sure that they get back to you. Gentlemen, I just really appreciate you. Charlie, I know you're back with us. So are you going to talk through the Behavior Power Pack real quick?
Yeah, you guys, thank you so much. Truly, Joe and TJ, it's really great hearing from you. I appreciate you being here and everybody else does too. I know it